Hello, this is part 3 of the DOE 25 training. This section is going to focus on your supplemental worksheets in the DOE 25 workbook. So the first supplemental sheet you'll encounter after finishing the DOE 25 is the elementary, secondary ESEA tieback. And that ties back to page 5, line 8 on your DOE 25 sheet and requires you to fill in any or all of these based on what grants you've expended money out. And that will tie back to page 5, line 8. One thing that sometimes happens is, even though it shows the subtotals down here, the small rural school achievement program is not part of this subtotal. So if you do have that grant, we do expect you to put it in here. However, do not use it as part of your tying out process, because that will not work, because it does not go on page 5, line 8. It goes on page 5, line 4 on your DOE 25 sheet for this grant, as it is a federal direct grant to you, bypassing the state. The next area we're looking at is mostly automated. For your food service attachment W is what our Food and Nutrition Bureau uses. So we've several years ago, we automated that to help them out, and also to help you from submitting the same data twice. So as you can see, most of it's will auto generate, and here is the description of where it's drawing the information from. So there's really only 2 areas, and possibly 3, you would need to fill out if you have a food service program. The top is audited yes and no. That's kind of common for districts to forget to put that in, but it is required. The next required one is the USDA value of USDA commodities. That needs to be filled in down here. This one may or may not need to be filled in if you have other expenditures related to food service that are not captured in the aforementioned lines for expenditures. So that's pretty much it for food service attachment. It's pretty straightforward, with just a few fields that need to be filled in. Next one is salaries, benefits. Again, this needs to be filled in due to federal reporting requirements. And again, there is a tieback feature here. So if I'm going to put in a number here, and it doesn't tie back to pages 7, 9, and 11 through 13, for the 1100 in this case, you're going to get a check total error. If we see anything with a check total error and the totals don't match, once in a while there'll be like a fraction, depending on how you fill out your DOE 25. It could be like a fractional cent or something like that, might trip the variance warning over here. So we'll let those go. However, if we do see a variance between the 2 totals in this, we will return your DOE 25 to be corrected. And again, it's 11, 12, 13, and 1400 accounts need to be filled in here in detail. Next one, indirect cost rates. There are a few changes this year. So we were audited last year by the Federal Indirect Cost Group, and they had a couple things they wanted us to update on our indirect cost information gathering. So I'll start with the ones down here. This is a repeat, but again, we always ask if you are requesting an indirect cost rate, because again, a lot of this will fill in automatically, and then there's the manual fields you would need to fill in that I'll talk about in a minute. So to save time, we always want you to put in whether you want one yes or no, because if you pick no, and we see that the sheet's not fully completed, we're not going to bother you or return your DOE 25. So you definitely want to fill that in to let us know what your choice is, if you want indirect costs generated for your future federal grants or not. The next one, and these next 2 are new, the cost of food for districts that outsource their food service. Again, this will only be if you're outsourcing your food service. So if you're running an in-house food service program, you do not need to fill this out, because there is a section on page 15 of the DOE 25 that has you fill in your cost of food. But so this is again for the federal government. So if you're outsourcing to a vendor, we want you to break out the cost of the food and put it there so we can report that. And the last one is the district's capitalization threshold. So that would be whatever is approved at your district level for what you consider capitalized, the limit for that versus something like supplies. So the federal limit is $5,000. So we would not expect to see any district's capitalization threshold be above that amount. Usually it's far below it. but we do want you to fill it in because that is another area that they need to know about. Another change, and this will only affect maybe a handful districts, maybe a dozen, is that they also want for districts over 2499 ADMA counts, also students in ADM in attendance, in addition to filling out the line up here for the cost of superintendent. We're also going to want the cost of your business officer, aka business administrator, if they're certified as such. And again, if they have a support person underneath them, a secretary, we would want that included as well. So similar methodology to how you handle your superintendent. And again, that's only for districts that have over 2499 ADMA. So that will be a new requirement, but only for a small chunk of districts. And I think the only other thing that's new is you no longer have to separately report your cost of school board audit. It used to be over here. That's gone, so you no longer have to do that. So there's really only the two fields of school board cost and the cost of superintendent and possibly business officer that need to be filled in here. Over here is portions of contracts above 25,000. These are calculated on an individual level. So if you have an individual contract for say $50,000 and it's instruction related, you would only report $25,000 here. So you do not count the first $25,000 of the contract. So you would fill in all the information for wherever it belongs for these individual contracts. And again, it's individual, not cumulative. So you take the first 25,000 off of each individual contract and then add that amount to the appropriate area. Okay, now on to the school level expenditures tab. This tab is where you're required to split out all your school level expenditures by both state/local on this column and federal expenditures on this column. And also for out of district tuition and transportation, obviously that's any students that you pay for tuition to send out of the district and any related transportation costs or any other costs associated with those students being educated outside your district. It's important that this gets split out and not just allocated to the schools, because that'll give it a artificially inflated cost per pupil for that school. And another thing to be aware of as you're filling this out is new for this year is the variance analysis that's been added. So if what you reported for this school, your previous fiscal year, has changed over 30% in either direction, you will get this warning message. So I would suggest that if you do get this warning message, just double check what you did last year and compare it to this year. And if this year is correct, that's fine. But I would suggest you go into the district notes tab and just put a quick explanation on why there was a variance from the previous year over 30%. And obviously go down for any applicable schools. You have it at 3 different grade span levels. And again, it's also important to make sure when you first cite the DOE 25 on cell A2 to do the pull down to choose your district first, because it does link to a number of areas on the DOE 25. So including this one, and it will autofill your schools for you. So that's pretty much the left side of the sheet. And over on the right side, U.S. Department of Ed, in conjunction with the Office of Civil Rights, also requires a little more breakdown of certain areas at the school level. So, for example, a function code 1000, 2100, 22, 24. And then over here, you just have like these additional items where it wants you to break down your teacher salaries that are in function code 1000. And then on the next column, your instructional aid salaries that are on 1000. The last column, they're just interested in books and periodicals for both the 1000 and 2200 series expenditures for object code 640 series. And this one is forgotten regularly on the DOE 25, probably since it's at the end and there's no built-in validations to show you if you're missing it. So there is a message on each one of these areas just to make sure you do put in your book expenditures. And if you don't have book expenditures for whatever reason, please just put in 0. So that lets us know that you are aware of these expenditures and you just don't have any, instead of just having forgotten them. One other thing to be aware of, I think, that I might not have mentioned is the grand total, this variance over here for each grade span level is just designed to compare the grand total versus what you filled out on your DOE 25 for the relevant areas. However, you still should be splitting, or you're required to split out your federal expenditures here. So don't just lump everything in state, local, have it tie out, because that also cause a return DOE 25. If you're reporting revenues on page 5 for federal revenue, and also, on the corresponding expenditure areas on pages 10 through 14, I'm sorry, 11 through 14 on the DOE 25 sheet, we're definitely going to expect to see some amounts over here as well. So that pretty much sums up this tab. And if you can look down here, there's a little more detail here. A lot of it's kind of just what I said. So make sure that this gets filled out fully, or else that'll also be returned to you. Thank you. The next couple sheets, you do not really need to do anything with. They're fully automated. The first one is the MS-25, which is a report that the Department of Revenue Administration uses to help do your tax rates each year. And that is fully generated by what's put into your DOE 25. So you don't really need to do anything here. I know they do. I know DRA at some point will require you to send them a copy of this. However, you do not need to do any extra work as far as data entry on this sheet. One other important thing to mention too is if your DRA municipal rep ever has you make any corrections to your MS-25, in which case you need to do through the DOE 25, and more often than not, or almost all the time, I'm going to go over here briefly. When they do want you to make changes, more often than not, it's going to be in this equity section, and it is very important that when you do that, is to go back to your DOE 25 and correct it on our end, and then that will generate your corrected MS-25. And you should do that through our system and not just do manual adjustments to your MS-25 on your end and then send it in, because that will cause a discrepancy in the data between the DRA and the DOE. And we always have to go hunting for these discrepancies later, as they could cause problems. So very important that if your DRA rep always wants you to make a correction, come back to the financial reporting system and do it through us, and then this will generate the correct MS-25 for DRA, and then all our data will be in alignment. Next one is district profile. That pretty simply consolidates the information you put in your DOE 25 into these wider categories. And this kind of gives you a kind of a snapshot of what's going on. Again, we use that for some of our federal reporting, and also our internal state reports that we post on our website. So not too much to really talk about here, because it's fully auto-generating. This last tab is one that often gets overlooked, sometimes almost by us when we're looking, because again, it's way off at the end, and it's right after the self-generated tabs. But it can be pretty important to also save time, as it allows you to put in any notes that you want us to know about. And part of our review process is we usually look at year-to-year trends. And if we see anything that seems wildly out of place, or something disappeared or moved or went up by a great amount or reduced by a great amount, that'll usually generate a question from us. So if you do have something going on, like if you have something in the other categories, and revenue, for example, and let's say you had like 10 million one year, and the next year you have like 75 million, and that's usually going to generate questions from us. So if we return your DOE 25, sometimes we'll add those questions in. And if you fill this in, a page number, line number, you can put in whatever notes you want and explain what these are, why they went up or down, why they appeared or disappeared. That's also very helpful for us, and it can help avoid further returns of your DOE 25 because we might look at it and think something's wrong. And if you explain it here, we'll say, oh, okay, that looks fine, or it might generate another question, or have us suggest something else. But again, if you have anything in your DOE 25 you think we're going to want to know about that's kind of different from your previous year, it's never a bad idea to put the information in here. And again, we'll check that when we're reviewing a DOE 25. And in many instances, it'll help us from responding back to you with more questions. And so it saves us time and saves you time, and you can get your DOE 25 approved quicker. So that's about it for the supplementals. So thank you very much, and that's the end of the meeting.